When my grandfather died, he left me his old cabin in the remote hollers of eastern Kentucky. I'd never been there before. Family never talked about it. The deed came with a handwritten note in his shaky handwriting. Do not go into the basement after sunset. At first, I thought it was just the rambling of an old man whose mind had started to slip in his final years. My name is Marcus, and I had just graduated from college with a business degree. The inheritance could not have come at a better time. Student loans were crushing me, and the job market was brutal. The idea of renovating an old mountain cabin and maybe turning it into a rental property seemed like the perfect solution to my financial problems. The drive up the winding mountain road took 3 hours from Lexington. The deeper I went into the hollers, the more isolated everything became. Cell phone service disappeared after the first hour. The GPS lost signal shortly after that. I had to rely on hand-drawn directions my grandmother had grudgingly provided when I pressed her about the location. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering oak and pine trees. It was larger than I had expected, to 2 stories with a wraparound porch that had seen better days. The wood siding was weathered gray, and several windows were boarded up. But the structure looked solid, and the metal roof appeared relatively new. I spent the first day cleaning and taking inventory. The cabin was furnished with heavy wooden furniture that probably dated back to the 1940s. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but underneath, I could see quality craftsmanship. My grandfather had been a carpenter before he retired, though no one in the family ever talked about what he did during his younger years in these mountains. The basement door was locked with 3 different deadbolts. I found the keys hanging on a nail beside the kitchen window, along with another note. Only during daylight hours, never after dark. This is not a suggestion. Curiosity got the better of me that first afternoon. I unlocked the basement door and descended the wooden steps. The basement was much larger than the footprint of the cabin should have allowed. It stretched back into the hillside, carved directly into the rock. The air smelled of copper and something sweet that I could not identify. What I found down there changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The basement was a fully operational moonshine distillery. Not just any distillery. This was a sophisticated operation with copper stills, aging barrels, and equipment that must have cost thousands of dollars. Everything was immaculate, as if someone had been maintaining it regularly. Some of the barrels had dates carved into them going back to 1952, but it was the back wall that made my blood run cold. Carved into the living rock were symbols I had never seen before, intricate patterns that seemed to move when I was not looking directly at them. Below the symbols was a ledger book, bound in what looked like leather but felt wrong to the touch. I opened the ledger with trembling hands. The first entry was dated August 15th, 1952, written in my grandfather's younger handwriting. Made the bargain today. The old woman in the deep holler said the spirits would protect the operation, make the whiskey flow pure and strong, keep the revenuers away. All I have to do is keep feeding them. 1 drop of blood for every batch. Seemed like a fair trade at the time. The entries continued for decades. My grandfather documented every batch he made, every drop of blood he offered, every sign that they were pleased with his work. The whiskey never spoiled. The authorities never found the operation. Business was good. But the entries grew more troubling over the years. September 3rd, 1967. They want more now. A drop is not enough. They whisper to me at night, telling me about the old ways, about what the mountain spirits really hunger for. October 31st, 1973 found a stranger on the property today. Told him to leave, but he kept asking questions about the operation. Had to make a choice. They were so hungry. I understand now why the old woman smiled when she told me about the bargain. December 12th, 1981. Sheriff came by asking about the missing hiker. I told him I had not seen anyone. technically true. There was not much left to see after I honored the agreement. The final entry was dated just 3 months before my grandfather's death. I'm old now and tired. The weight of what I have done sits heavy on my soul, but the bargain cannot be broken. It passes to the next generation. I pray Marcus will be stronger than I was. I pray he will find a way to end this. The basement key comes with a price. The blood debt must be paid, or they will take what they are owed from everyone I ever loved. I slammed the ledger shut and backed away from the wall. This had to be the delusions of an old man. Mountain folklore run wild. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something that made my knees buckle. Fresh footprints in the dust, multiple sets, leading from the symbols on the wall to the distillery equipment. The equipment that someone had been maintaining. The equipment that was still warm to the touch. I ran up the basement stairs and locked all 3 deadbolts behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the keys. I needed to get out of there, needed to call someone, needed to pretend I had never found that ledger. But my car would not start. The engine turned over, but immediately died. I tried again and again, but it was as if something was preventing the engine from running. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of old blood. That was when I heard the voices. They started as whispers, so faint I thought it might be wind through the trees. But gradually they became clearer. Multiple voices speaking in unison, calling my name. They were coming from the basement. Marcus, Marcus, come down to us. The debt must be paid. Your grandfather promised. The bargain must be honored. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices seemed to come from inside my head now. I could smell that sweet scent from the basement wafting up through the floorboards. But now I recognized what it was. The smell of old blood mixed with moonshine. We have been patient, Marcus. We have waited for you. Your grandfather fed us well over the years, but he is gone now. The mountain spirits must be fed. Come down to us. Let us show you the old ways. The basement door began to rattle against its locks. Something was trying to get out. Or maybe trying to get me to come down. I grabbed a flashlight and my grandfather's shotgun from above the fireplace. The shells were old, but they would have to do. I was not going down to that basement, but if something came up, I would be ready. The rattling stopped. The voices faded to whispers again. But I could hear new sounds now, machinery running in the basement. The distillery was operating on its own. I could smell fresh moonshine cooking, and underneath it, that sickly sweet smell of blood. Hours passed. I sat in the kitchen chair with the shotgun across my lap, watching the basement door. Around midnight, I heard my grandfather's voice, clear as day. Boy, you cannot fight them forever. I tried for 60 years to keep the bargain small, to minimize the damage, but they grow stronger every year. Every drop of blood I gave them made them hungrier. You can end this, but only if you go down there and face what I created. I wanted to ignore it, wanted to wait until sunrise and run, but something in his voice made me believe this was really my grandfather, not the things in the basement mimicking him. How? I whispered to the empty room. The symbols on the wall. They are not just decoration, they are a contract written in blood and stone. But every contract has terms, and every deal has an escape clause. You have to read the whole thing, Marcus. You have to understand what I agreed to, and find the way out I was too proud to look for. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the sounds from the basement finally stopped. I unlocked the 3 deadbolts and made my way down the stairs again. The distillery was silent now, but there were 5 fresh jugs of moonshine sitting on the table that had not been there the day before. I approached the wall of symbols with new eyes. This time I did not just look at the obvious carvings. I examined every inch of the rock face, looking for something my grandfather might have missed. There, almost hidden in a natural crack in the stone, I found it. A small symbol, different from the others. When I touched it, the rock seemed to warm under my fingers, and suddenly I could read the symbols like words on a page. The contract was exactly what my grandfather had described: protection and prosperity in exchange for blood. But the escape clause was there, written in letters so small they were almost invisible. The debt could be transferred back to the mountain spirits themselves if the human party was willing to destroy the thing they had created and walk away from all its benefits. I spent that day smashing every piece of equipment in the basement. I poured out every drop of moonshine. I burned the ledger and scattered the ashes. And when I was done, I pressed my hand to that hidden symbol and spoke the words I found carved there in letters smaller than ant tracks. The symbols on the wall began to fade. The sweet smell of blood disappeared, and for the first time in 3 days, I felt like I could breathe freely. I left the mountains that afternoon and never went back. The cabin still legally belongs to me, but I will never set foot on that property again. I sold my car and used the money to pay down my student loans. Got a normal job in a normal city. But sometimes, late at night, I still smell moonshine and copper. And I wonder if I really broke that bargain, or if the mountain spirits are just waiting for me to make a mistake, to show weakness, to give them an opening to collect what they believe they are still owed. The mountains of eastern Kentucky remember everything, and some debts once made are never truly forgiven. I am a documentary filmmaker specializing in abandoned places. When I heard about Mill Haven Hollow, an abandoned coal mining town tucked deep in the West Virginia mountains, I knew I had to film there. The locals in the nearest town, which was still 40 miles away, warned me about the night shift. Workers who never stopped working, even though the mine had been closed for 30 years. My name is Sarah Chen, and I have been documenting America's forgotten places for 5 years. Ghost towns, abandoned factories, closed mental hospitals, anywhere time has stopped and history has been left to rot. Mill Haven Hollow was different from my usual subjects. Most abandoned places die slowly, but Mill Haven had died all at once, in a single catastrophic moment. The company records I found in the county courthouse told the official story. On November 15th, 1994, a methane gas explosion killed 43 miners during the night shift. The bodies were never recovered. The tunnel collapse was too extensive, and the company decided it was safer to seal the mine permanently than risk more lives attempting a recovery. Mill Haven Mining Corporation paid the families, shuttered the operation, and disappeared into bankruptcy within 6 months. But the unofficial story, the one whispered in diners and gas stations throughout the region, was much darker. I reached Mill Haven Hollow on a gray October morning. The road in was barely more than a logging trail, overgrown with 20 years of forest reclaiming the land. My 4-wheel drive truck bounced through potholes that could swallow a small car. When the trees finally opened up, I got my first look at what had once been home to nearly 300 people. The company town was laid out in perfect geometric precision. Rows of identical miners' houses marched up the hillside like gray wooden tombstones. At the bottom of the valley sat the industrial buildings, the mine entrance, the processing plant, the company store. Everything was weathered silver, with kudzu vines crawling over the structures like nature trying to hide an ugly scar. I set up my base camp in what had been the mine supervisor's house, the largest building in town. The electricity had been cut decades ago, but I brought generators and battery packs for my equipment. I planned to spend 3 days documenting the site, creating a short film about industrial decline in Appalachia. The first day went smoothly. I filmed the exterior shots, captured the haunting beauty of abandonment, interviewed myself about the historical context. The mine entrance was sealed with a massive concrete plug, but I could still feel cool air seeping out around the edges. Someone had spray painted "They're still down there" across the concrete in red letters that looked disturbingly fresh. That night, I reviewed my footage in the supervisor's house. Everything looked good, though I noticed some strange audio anomalies on the recordings. What sounded like distant machinery running, metal on metal, the rhythmic pounding of industrial equipment. I assumed it was interference from my generators. The second day, I decided to explore the miners' houses. Most were unlocked. No point securing buildings that contain nothing but rotting furniture and old memories. I was documenting the interior of house after house, each one telling the same story of families who had packed up and left in a hurry. Children's toys scattered on bedroom floors. Half-eaten meals still sitting on kitchen tables, now covered in decades of dust and mouse droppings. It was in the 15th house that I found the journal. Mary Kowalski had lived at 247 Miners Row with her husband Frank and their 2 children. Frank worked the night shift in Tunnel 7, the deepest section of the mine. Mary's journal entries from the weeks leading up to the explosion painted a picture of growing unease among the miners' families. October 20th, 1994. Frank came home early again today. Said there were problems in Tunnel 7. The men are scared, but the bosses keep pushing them deeper. Frank says they hit some kind of underground cavity last week, bigger than anything they expected. The air down there smells wrong, he says, sweet and sick. October 28th, 1994. 3 families moved away this week. The Hendersons, the Martins, and the O'Briens. They left everything behind, just packed their clothes and drove away. Frank says it is about money, but I think they know something the rest of us do not. November 3rd, 1994. Something is wrong with the mine. Frank will not talk about it, but I can see it in his eyes. He barely sleeps anymore. Last night, I heard him praying in Polish, like his grandmother taught him when he was little. He has not prayed in Polish since his mother's funeral. November 12th, 1994. Frank told me tonight that they found bones in the new cavity. Old bones, arranged in patterns. The company geologist said they were probably Indian burials, but Frank thinks they are older than that, much older. He says the bones were not human. The final entry was dated November 14th, 1994, one day before the explosion. November 14th, 1994. Frank did not come home from his shift. None of the night shift men came home. The mine boss says there was an equipment malfunction and they are working through the day to fix it. But I can hear sounds coming from the mine. Machinery running, metal pounding, voices calling out. It has been going on for 18 hours straight. I'm packing the children's things. We are leaving tonight. I checked the records again. Mary Kowalski and her children had died in the explosion. The official report said they were visiting the mine when the blast occurred, bringing dinner to the workers. But that did not make sense. Why would a mother bring her small children to a dangerous mine site at 3 a.m? As evening approached on my second day, I decided to set up a camera near the sealed mine entrance. If there really were audio anomalies, I wanted to capture them properly. I positioned the camera about 50 feet from the concrete barrier and let it run continuously. At 11:47 p.m., the sounds began. At first, it was just what I had heard in my earlier recordings. Distant machinery, the echo of metal tools striking stone. But as midnight approached, the sounds became clearer, more organized. I could distinguish individual voices calling out instructions, the squeak of mine cartwheels on tracks, the rhythmic pounding of pickaxes against rock. I grabbed my handheld camera and approached the mine entrance. The sounds were definitely coming from behind the concrete seal, not echoes from somewhere else, not audio interference. Actual sounds of active mining operations coming from a mine that had been sealed for 30 years. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the time recorded for the original explosion, the sound stopped. Complete silence fell over the valley. Then, a few minutes later, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Voices, calling out names. The same 43 names I had read in the casualty report from 1994. Frank Kowalski, Tommy Henderson, Miguel Santos, Bobby Lee Wilson. The voices were coming from different directions now, not just from the mine entrance, from the abandoned houses, from the processing plant, from the company store. Dozens of voices calling the names of the dead miners over and over again. I ran back to the supervisor's house and locked myself inside. Through the windows, I could see lights moving through the abandoned town, flashlight beams and lantern glow, as if people were searching the empty buildings. But there were no people. I was the only living person in Millhaven Hollow. The voices continued until dawn. Always the same 43 names, called out by unseen voices, answered by echoes that came from underground. On the third morning, I knew I had to go into the mine. I found a way in through the old ventilation shaft behind the processing plant. The concrete seal only covered the main entrance. The ventilation system was blocked with rusted grating, but my crowbar made quick work of it. I strapped on my helmet light and grabbed my camera. The tunnel was in better condition than I had expected. No cave-ins, no flooding. The rail tracks were still in place, disappearing into the darkness ahead of me. But something was wrong with the air. It had that sweet, sick smell Mary Kowalski had written about in her journal. I followed the tracks deeper into the mountain. The main tunnel branched off in several directions, but I followed the signs pointing toward Tunnel 7, the deepest section where the explosion had supposedly occurred. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about the Millhaven disaster. Tunnel 7 was not collapsed. It opened into a massive underground cavern, far larger than any natural formation should have been at this depth. The cavern was filled with mining equipment, but not equipment from 1994. This machinery looked older, more primitive, but it was running. Steam-powered pumps, hand-cranked winches, pickaxes, and shovels, and standing at each piece of equipment were the miners. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense. They were solid, real, covered in coal dust and sweat. But their eyes were wrong, empty, vacant, like sleepwalkers. They worked with mechanical precision, never speaking, never resting, loading coal cars that would never leave the mine, digging tunnels that led nowhere, following orders from supervisors who had been dead for 30 years. I recognized Frank Kowalski from a photograph I had found in his house. He was operating a manual drilling machine, his movements precise and repetitive. When I called his name, he looked up at me with those empty eyes and smiled. "You're just in time for the night shift," he said in a voice that echoed strangely in the cavern. "We have been expecting you." That was when I noticed the bones Mary had written about. They were not arranged randomly around the cavern. They formed a perfect circle in the center of the mining operation. And they were not old Indian burial remains. They were the bones of miners, dozens of them, from different time periods. Some were dressed in modern mining gear, others in clothes that looked like they dated back to the early 1900s. "The mountain has always needed workers," Frank continued, still working his drilling machine with mechanical precision. "Every generation, it calls for more. The Kowalski family has been answering that call for 4 generations now. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, now me. Soon my son will join us when he is old enough." I backed away toward the tunnel entrance, but other miners moved to block my path. Their movements were coordinated, like they shared a single mind. "The company made a deal long before any of us were born," Frank explained. "The mountain gives up its coal, and in exchange, it gets to keep the workers. Forever. We mine, we die, we keep mining. It is a good deal for everyone." I realized then what had really happened in 1994. There had been no methane explosion. The 43 miners had simply been claimed by whatever ancient force lived in the mountain. The company had sealed the mine not to prevent cave-ins, but to hide the truth about their unholy partnership with something that should never have been disturbed. "Your documentary will help bring more workers," Frank said, still smiling that empty smile. "People will come looking for the truth about Millhaven. The mountain is always hungry for fresh workers." I broke free and ran for the ventilation shaft. Behind me, I could hear the miners following, their boots echoing in the tunnels. But they moved with that same mechanical precision. They were not built for chasing. They were built for working. I made it to the surface and ran to my truck. The engine started immediately, and I drove out of Millhaven Hollow without looking back. But as I reached the main road, I could see lights beginning to flicker on in the abandoned houses behind me. The town was waking up for another shift. I never finished my documentary about Millhaven Hollow. I never released any of the footage I shot there. Some stories are too dangerous to tell, especially when telling them might bring more people to places they should never go. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear Frank Kowalski calling my name. And I know that somewhere deep in the West Virginia mountains, 43 miners are still working the night shift, waiting for new workers to join them in a mine that will never stop producing coal for a company that has been dead for 30 years. The mountain remembers its deals, and some contracts are written in more than just ink and paper. My daughter was dying, and the doctors could not help her. That was when someone mentioned the herb woman deep in the hollers of eastern Tennessee. They said she could cure anything, for a price. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and 6 months ago, I was a successful pharmaceutical sales representative living in Nashville with my 8-year-old daughter, Emma. We had a normal life: soccer practice, piano lessons, family dinners at chain restaurants. Then Emma started getting sick. It began with fatigue. Emma would fall asleep during her favorite TV shows, struggle to keep up during soccer games. The pediatrician said it was probably a growth spurt, maybe a minor vitamin deficiency. We ran some basic blood tests. Everything came back normal. But Emma kept getting worse. She lost weight, developed dark circles under her eyes, complained of constant headaches. Her hair started falling out in small patches. She would wake up crying in the middle of the night, saying her bones hurt. More tests, more specialists, more normal results that did not explain why my vibrant little girl was slowly fading away. By month 4, Emma could barely get out of bed. She had lost 20 pounds from her already small frame. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that reminded me of old paper. The best doctors in Nashville were baffled. They ran every test imaginable: cancer screenings, autoimmune panels, genetic testing, toxicology screens, nothing. According to medical science, there was nothing wrong with my daughter, but I could see her dying a little more each day. That was when my cleaning lady, an elderly woman named Dolores, who had worked for my family for 3 years, pulled me aside one afternoon while Emma was sleeping. "There is someone who might be able to help," she whispered, glancing toward Emma's bedroom. "My grandmother told me about her when I was little. They call her the herb woman. She lives way up in the mountains, past where the roads end. Some say she is a witch. Others say she is a saint. But everyone agrees she can heal what doctors cannot." I was desperate enough to listen. Dolores gave me directions that sounded like something from a fairy tale. Follow the old mining road until it turns to dirt, then take the path marked by 3 white stones, cross the creek where the water runs red from iron ore. Climb until you find the garden that grows in the shadows. I loaded Emma into the car on a gray October morning. She was so weak, I had to carry her to the passenger seat. She slept for most of the 3-hour drive into the mountains. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to dirt, then to barely visible tire tracks carved through the forest floor. I found the 3 white stones exactly where Dolores said they would be. The path beyond was so narrow I had to park the car and carry Emma on my back. She weighed nothing, just skin and bones, and labored breathing against my neck. The creek was there too, running rust red over smooth stones, and beyond that, climbing steeply through pine and oak, a trail that looked like it had been walked by countless desperate parents over the years. I carried Emma for 2 hours. Just when I thought I could not take another step, the trees opened into a clearing unlike anything I had ever seen. The garden grew in complete shadow under a canopy so thick that no direct sunlight reached the ground. But somehow, the plants were thriving. Massive vegetables, herbs I could not identify, flowers in colors that seemed too bright for the dim light. Everything was larger than it should have been, healthier than it should have been, growing in soil that should not have been able to support such abundance. At the center of the garden stood a cabin that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. The walls were made of living trees, their trunks bent and shaped but still growing, their roots disappearing into the foundation. Moss covered the roof, and strange wind chimes made from bones and polished stones hung from the eaves. An old woman emerged from the cabin as I approached. She was ancient. Her face was so wrinkled it looked like carved wood, and her hair was white as mountain snow. But her eyes were sharp and green as spring leaves, and when she looked at Emma sleeping in my arms, I saw something that might have been pity. "You have come far," she said in a voice that rustled like autumn leaves. "The child is sick with something that has no name in your world." "Can you help her?" I asked, not caring how desperate I sounded. The old woman studied Emma with those sharp green eyes. She touched my daughter's forehead with fingers that looked like gnarled twigs, then stepped back and nodded slowly. "Yes, I can help her, but healing like this requires payment. Not money. I have no use for your paper dollars. The old magic demands sacrifice." "Anything," I said immediately. "I will pay anything." The herb woman smiled, and I noticed her teeth were too white, too sharp. "Careful with such promises, child. The mountain spirits take words seriously, especially words spoken by desperate mothers." She led us into her cabin. The interior was larger than the exterior should have allowed, with rooms that seemed to stretch back into the hillside itself. The walls were lined with jars, containing things I did not want to examine too closely. Floating specimens, dried plants, powders in colors that hurt to look at. The old woman laid Emma on a bed made from living wood, the branches still growing and intertwining around the sleeping child. She began to work with movements that looked like a dance, gathering ingredients from various jars, grinding them in a mortar made from black stone, muttering words in a language that sounded older than English, older than any language I recognized. "Your child has been marked," she explained as she worked. "Something wants her, something that feeds on youth and health and the bright energy of childhood. It has been draining her slowly, savoring the process. In your world of hospitals and medicines, there's no name for such hunger." "What kind of something?" I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to know. "Old things. Things that were here before your people built their cities and roads. They sleep in the deep places, but sometimes they wake up hungry. Your daughter was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and something decided she would make a good meal." The herb woman finished her preparation and brought me a cup filled with liquid that smelled like rich earth and growing things. "Give this to her 3 times. Once now, once at sunset, once at midnight. By sunrise, the marking will be gone. She will be healthy again, stronger than before." "What is the price?" I asked, because I knew there had to be one. The old woman smiled again, and this time I was sure her teeth were longer than they had been before. "Simple. One day, when she's grown, your daughter will return to me. She will spend 1 year learning the old ways, helping me tend the garden, assisting with the healing work. After that year, she can choose to stay and become my successor or return to your world. Either way, the debt will be paid." It seemed reasonable, more than reasonable. A year of my daughter's adult life in exchange for all the years she would not have if I did not accept the deal. I agreed immediately. Emma drank the first cup of medicine without waking up. Her breathing improved almost instantly, color returning to her cheeks like sunrise spreading across a pale sky. For the first time in months, She looked peaceful instead of pained. We stayed in the herb woman's cabin that day. Emma woke up around noon and ate her first real meal in weeks. Bread that tasted like honey, vegetables that seemed to glow with their own inner light, water that was so pure it made my teeth ache. She laughed for the first time in months, and the sound echoed through the cabin like music. At sunset, Emma drank the second cup. Her hair stopped falling out, and the gray pallor left her skin entirely. She played with wooden toys the herb woman carved for her, while we waited for midnight. The final dose came at the darkest hour of the night. Emma drank it eagerly, trusting completely in the process that was bringing her back to life. Within minutes, she was sleeping the deep, healthy sleep of a normal child. We left the next morning. Emma walked down the mountain path on her own legs, chattering about everything she saw, pointing out birds and flowers and interesting rocks. She was not just healthy. She was vibrant, energetic, more alive than she had ever been. The doctors in Nashville called it a miracle. Whatever had been wrong with Emma was simply gone, leaving no trace behind. They wanted to study her, run tests, write papers. I refused. Some miracles are not meant to be understood by science. For 5 years, Emma thrived. She excelled in school, starred on her soccer team, learned to play 3 different instruments. She grew tall and strong and beautiful, with an inner light that made everyone around her smile. I almost forgot about the deal I had made in that shadowed garden. Almost. On Emma's 13th birthday, she started having dreams about the mountains. She would wake up talking about a garden where impossible things grew, about an old woman who needed her help, about a debt that needed to be paid. At first, I thought they were just strange dreams, maybe memories of our trip surfacing as she got older. But the dreams became more frequent, more detailed. Emma would describe plants I had never told her about, rooms in the cabin she had never seen. She started sleepwalking, heading toward the door, as if trying to walk back to Tennessee in the middle of the night. That was when I realized the truth about the herb woman's payment plan. The old woman had not just healed Emma. She had marked her, claimed her, begun a slow process of calling her back. The year of service would not wait until Emma was grown. It would happen whenever the herb woman decided to collect. Last week, Emma disappeared from her bedroom in the middle of the night. I found a note on her pillow, written in handwriting that looked like mine but felt wrong somehow. Gone to pay the debt. Do not follow. Some promises cannot be broken, and some payments cannot be delayed. She will be safe with me, learning things your world could never teach her. When her education is complete, you will see her again. Maybe. I drove to Tennessee immediately, following the same route I had taken 5 years earlier. But when I reached the place where the 3 white stones should have been, there was nothing. No markers, no path, no creek running red with iron ore. Just endless forest stretching up the mountainside. I hired local guides, search and rescue teams, even brought in private investigators with helicopters and thermal imaging equipment. We searched for weeks. No one found any trace of a garden in the shadows, or a cabin built from living trees, or an old woman who could heal what doctors could not. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the mountains just right, I swear I can hear Emma laughing. She sounds happy. She sounds healthy. She sounds like she is learning things that no normal child should ever need to know. The herb woman kept her side of the bargain. Emma was healed, stronger than before, full of vibrant life. But the payment plan was never what I thought it was. I traded 1 year of my daughter's adult life, and the herb woman collected 13 years of her childhood instead. Some deals are not what they seem, and some healers understand that the most powerful magic requires more than herbs and potions. It requires hope, desperation, and the willingness of a parent to sacrifice anything for their child. I just hope that when Emma's education in the old ways is complete, she will remember who she was before she became whatever the herb woman is teaching her to be, and I hope she will choose to come home, even though home might feel small and ordinary after living in a place where impossible things grow in shadows that never see the sun. The mountains of Tennessee remember every deal ever made in their depths, and some debts can only be paid with the people we love most. I was lead surveyor for Apex Logging Company. My job was to map out the old-growth forest we were about to clear-cut in the remote mountains of North Carolina. The Cherokee had sacred sites there, but the company did not care about superstitions. That indifference would cost us more than any of us could have imagined. My name is David Clearwater, and I had been working in forestry for 15 years. I specialized in surveying virgin timber stands, the kind of ancient forests that timber companies salivate over. Old-growth trees meant massive profits. Some of those oaks and chestnuts were worth more per board foot than most people made in a month. The Nantahala Forest contract was the biggest job of my career. Apex had acquired logging rights to 12,000 acres of pristine mountain forest through a complex web of land deals and legal maneuvering. The environmentalists were screaming. The Cherokee Nation had filed multiple injunctions, but Apex had money and lawyers. The cutting was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. My team consisted of 5 people: myself, 2 junior surveyors named Mike and Janet, a soil specialist called Rodriguez, and our Cherokee liaison, Thomas Raven. The government required us to have a tribal representative present during the surveying phase, supposedly to identify and protect any cultural sites we might encounter. Thomas was not happy about the arrangement. He made that clear from the moment we met at the staging area, a cleared lot 20 miles from the nearest paved road. He was a man in his 50s, with graying braids and eyes that seemed to see things the rest of us missed. "This forest has been protected by my people for 800 years, he told me as we loaded equipment into our 4-wheel drive vehicles. There are places in these mountains that should never be disturbed. Sacred groves where the old ceremonies were performed. Burial grounds that predate European contact by centuries. We will mark any sites you identify," I assured him, though we both knew that protected areas would be token gestures at best. Apex was not paying millions for logging rights just to leave the valuable timber standing. "You do not understand," Thomas replied. "Some places are protected by more than just laws and treaties. Some places protect themselves." We drove into the forest on logging roads that had not been used in decades. The deeper we went, the older the trees became. These were giants that had been growing since before Columbus, oak trees with trunks so massive it would take 6 people holding hands to encircle them. The canopy was so thick that even midday felt like twilight. Our first camp was at the base of a ridge the maps called Grandfather Mountain. Thomas immediately identified it as a sacred site, a place where Cherokee spiritual leaders had conducted vision quests for generations. I dutifully marked it on my survey maps, knowing that Apex would find a way to log around it if the timber was valuable enough. The second day, we began the systematic grid survey that would map every tree worth cutting. Mike and Janet worked the lower elevations, while Rodriguez took soil samples to determine the best routes for heavy equipment. I worked the ridgelines with Thomas, ostensibly getting his input on cultural sites, but really just ensuring he did not interfere with the surveying process. That was when we found the first grove. It was unlike anything I had ever seen in 15 years of forest work. A perfect circle of ancient oak trees, each one massive enough to be worth $50,000 on the timber market. But it was not just their size that was remarkable. It was their arrangement. They formed a precise geometric pattern, too perfect to be natural, growing from soil that was black as coal and rich as garden loam. "Vision Grove," Thomas said quietly when he saw it. "This is where my ancestors came to speak with the spirits of the forest. The trees here are not just old, they are aware." I was busy calculating board feet and market value. The grove represented nearly $500,000 in prime timber. There was no way Apex would leave it standing, sacred site or not. "We need to mark this for protection," Thomas insisted. "I will note it in my report," I said. But we both knew what that meant. Thomas walked to the center of the grove and placed his hand on the trunk of the largest oak. I watched him through my surveying scope, and I could have sworn the tree's leaves rustled without any wind. "They know what you plan to do," he said when he returned. "The forest spirits are waking up. They have been sleeping for decades, but your presence here, your intentions, have disturbed their rest." I did not believe in forest spirits, but there was something unsettling about the grove. My electronic equipment kept malfunctioning when I got close to the trees. My GPS showed impossible readings, coordinates that placed us hundreds of miles from where we actually were. Even my mechanical compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The third day, things began to go wrong. Mike was working a section of hillside when his chainsaw blade shattered for no apparent reason. The metal fragments could have killed him, but somehow every piece missed. When we examined the saw, the blade had not broken. It had been twisted into a perfect spiral, as if something had grabbed it while it was running and reshaped it like clay. Janet reported similar problems with her equipment. Her measuring devices gave readings that changed every time she looked at them. Her camera captured images of trees that were not there when she took the pictures. And everywhere we worked, we found evidence of something moving through the forest around us. Massive trees had been pushed over during the night, their roots torn from the earth as if by tremendous force. But they had not fallen randomly. They blocked every access road we had mapped, creating barriers that would make it impossible for logging trucks to reach the valuable timber. "The forest is fighting back," Thomas observed. "It knows what is coming." Rodriguez was the first to disappear. He was taking soil samples near the Vision Grove when we lost radio contact. When we went looking for him, we found his equipment scattered across half an acre: soil auger, sample containers, his GPS unit smashed to pieces, but no sign of Rodriguez himself. We called for search and rescue, but the nearest team was 4 hours away by helicopter. While we waited, Mike volunteered to hike back to our vehicles and call for additional help. That was the last time anyone saw Mike alive. By the fourth day, only Janet, Thomas, and I remained. Our radio equipment was completely dead, our vehicles would not start, and we were effectively trapped 20 miles from the nearest road. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that the forest had started to change around us. Trees that had been in one location the day before were now somewhere else entirely. Landmarks we had carefully mapped and GPS coordinated were simply gone, replaced by terrain that did not match our survey data. It was as if the forest was rearranging itself, creating a maze that shifted whenever we were not looking directly at it. "The spirits are protecting their domain," Thomas explained as we huddled around our camp stove that night. "They are showing you what they think of your plans to destroy their home." I was beginning to believe him. My rational scientific mind rejected the idea of conscious trees and forest spirits, but the evidence was overwhelming. The forest was actively resisting our presence, using methods that defied natural law. Janet broke sometime during the night. I woke up to find her standing at the edge of our campsite, staring into the darkness between the trees. When I called her name, she did not respond. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to me with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "They're calling," she said in a voice that was not quite her own. "The old ones. They want to show me the deep places, the root chambers, where the first songs are still singing." She walked into the forest, and despite our shouting and pursuit, we never saw her again. Her footprints led to the Vision Grove, where they simply ended in the circle of ancient oaks. Thomas and I were alone now, surrounded by a forest that had become actively hostile to our presence. Every direction we tried to hike led us back to the same clearing. Every path we followed turned into an endless loop that deposited us back where we started. There is only one way out, Thomas told me on the 5th morning. You have to convince your company to abandon the logging contract. The forest spirits will not release us until they know their home is safe. That is insane, I said. I cannot just call off a multi-million-dollar operation because of some supernatural forest protection scheme. Then we will die here, Thomas replied calmly. And your colleagues will die when they come looking for us. And the logging crews will die when they try to cut the sacred groves. The forest spirits have been patient for decades, but their patience has limits. To prove his point, Thomas led me to a hillside we had not seen before, though it should have been impossible to miss during our systematic survey. The slope was covered with the bones of men and machines, rusted logging equipment from different eras, the skeletal remains of lumberjacks and surveyors who had tried to violate the forest's boundaries over the decades. Some of the bones were ancient, dating back to the early days of industrial logging. Others were more recent. I recognized a surveying instrument from the 1980s, still clutched in the bony fingers of its former operator. Every generation someone gets greedy, Thomas explained. Every generation someone thinks they can take what the forest spirits protect. They all end up here, eventually. I used my satellite phone to call Apex headquarters. The connection was impossibly clear for such a remote location, as if the forest wanted to make sure my message got through. Cancel the contract, I told my boss. The environmental surveys were wrong. The timber quality is poor, the terrain is unsuitable for heavy equipment, and there are endangered species throughout the area. Are you insane, Clearwater? Do you have any idea how much money we have invested in this project? Cancel it, I repeated, or lose every crew you send in here. This place is protected by things that do not show up on government surveys. It took 3 days of increasingly desperate phone calls, but I finally convinced Apex to abandon the logging contract. The company would lose millions, but that was better than losing lives. The moment I received confirmation that the contract had been terminated, the forest released us. The path back to our vehicles appeared as if it had always been there. Our trucks started immediately. The GPS systems worked perfectly, showing us the direct route back to civilization. I quit Apex logging the day after we returned. I now work for the Forest Service, helping to establish protected wilderness areas. I make a fraction of what I used to earn, but I sleep better at night. Thomas and I stay in touch. He tells me the Vision Grove is thriving, growing larger each year. New oaks have appeared in the perfect circle, young trees that seem to grow impossibly fast, as if they are eager to join the ancient guardians. Sometimes, when the wind is right, Thomas says he can still hear Janet singing in the deep places beneath the roots. She chose to stay with the forest spirits, to become part of the protection that keeps the sacred groves safe from those who would destroy them for profit. The Cherokee Nation eventually reclaimed the entire 12,000 acres through a complex legal battle that Apex was too weakened to fight. The forest is protected now by both federal law and older, more powerful guardians that do not need courts or treaties to enforce their will. I never found Rodriguez or Mike. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to equipment failure and exposure. But sometimes I wonder if they joined Janet in the deep places, if they became part of the forest's immune system, helping to protect the ancient groves from future threats. The mountains of North Carolina remember every tree that has ever grown in their soil, and some forests have guardians that are far older and more powerful than any government agency or logging company. Apex learned that lesson the hard way, but they learned it nonetheless. Some places are sacred not because humans declare them so, but because they have always been sacred, protected by forces that do not recognize the authority of deeds and contracts. The Vision Grove still stands, its ancient oaks growing stronger each year, watched over by spirits that remember when the world was young and the forest stretched unbroken from mountain to sea. I was stationed at a remote weather monitoring station high in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. The only connection to civilization was my radio. Then one night, I picked up a broadcast that should not have existed, from a town that was flooded 50 years ago. My name is Marcus Hendricks, and I had been working for the National Weather Service for 12 years. I specialized in operating the remote automated weather stations that dot the Appalachian Mountains, collecting data that helps predict severe weather patterns across the region. It was solitary work, but I preferred it that way. No office politics, no crowded commutes, just me in the mountains and the endless stream of atmospheric data. The station at Devil's Backbone Ridge was one of the most isolated in our network. Perched on a rocky outcrop at 4,000 feet elevation, it monitored weather patterns across a 100-mile radius of wilderness. The nearest town was 40 miles down a winding mountain road that became impassable during winter storms. I would spend 2 weeks at a time up there, maintaining equipment and ensuring continuous data transmission to our headquarters in Sterling. The facility consisted of a small concrete building housing the computer systems, a tall radio tower for data transmission, and various weather sensors scattered across the ridge. My living quarters were Spartan, a single room with a cot, a desk, and the radio equipment that served as my link to the outside world. The radio was essential not just for work communications, but for emergency contact should something go wrong in that remote location. I had been stationed there for 3 months when the strange broadcast began. It started on a Tuesday night in October. I was reviewing the day's weather data when I heard a faint signal bleeding through on an emergency frequency. At first, I thought it was interference from the data transmission equipment, but as I adjusted the radio settings, the signal became clearer. This is WKVL broadcasting from Millerville, Virginia. The time is 11:37 p.m., and here's what's happening in our community tonight. I knew every radio station in the region, and WKVL was not among them. More importantly, there was no town called Millerville anywhere in Virginia. I had topographic maps of the entire area, and no such place existed, but the signal was strong and clear, as if the broadcast was coming from just down the mountain. The announcer continued with local news that made no sense. He talked about a new dam construction project, about families being relocated to higher ground, about concerns from residents who did not want to leave their ancestral homes. He mentioned dates, October 15th, 1973, and spoke as if these were current events. I checked my equipment. Everything was functioning normally. I switched to other frequencies, and normal radio traffic came through clearly. But when I returned to that emergency frequency, the mysterious broadcast continued. Folks, I want to remind everyone that tomorrow is the last day to register your concerns about the dam project at the town hall. After that, the Army Corps of Engineers will begin the final phase of construction. Those of you in the lower valley areas should have your relocation plans finalized by the end of the week. A chill ran down my spine. I had heard about the dam projects of the 1970s, when the federal government had flooded entire valleys to create reservoirs. Whole communities had been relocated, their histories erased beneath hundreds of feet of water. But this broadcast was speaking about these events as if they were happening right now, in 2024. I tried to respond on the frequency, but there was no acknowledgement. The broadcast continued as if I was not there, as if I was listening to something that existed in a different time entirely. The next night, the broadcast returned at the same time. This time, the tone was more urgent. This is WKVL, and we're coming to you live from what may be our final broadcast from Millerville. The dam construction has accelerated, and we've been told that the valley will begin flooding within 48 hours. Many of our neighbors have already left, but some families are refusing to abandon their homes. The announcer's voice cracked with emotion as he continued. My own family has lived in this valley for 5 generations. My great-great-grandfather built the house where I'm broadcasting from tonight. And tomorrow, the Army Corps is coming to force us out. They say it's for the greater good, for flood control and hydroelectric power. But they're drowning our history, our memories, everything that made us who we are. I was transfixed by the broadcast. I researched historical records and found references to a small community that had been flooded in 1973 to create what was now Claytor Lake. The town had been called Millerville, and yes, there had been a small radio station that had broadcast until the very end, but this was impossible. I was hearing a broadcast from 50 years ago as if it was happening in real time. The third night, the broadcast was desperate. This is what we believe will be our final transmission from WKVL in Millerville. The water started rising at dawn, and is coming faster than anyone expected. Most of the town is already underwater. I'm broadcasting from the second floor of the old church on the hill, the highest point in town. I could hear water in the background now, a steady rushing sound that grew louder as the broadcast continued. If anyone is out there listening, please remember us. Remember that Millerville existed, that real people lived here, that we had dreams and hopes and lives that mattered. The government says this is progress, that our sacrifice will benefit millions of people downstream. But they're wrong about one thing. We're not really gone. Some of us chose to stay. The signal was getting weaker now, interrupted by static and strange echoes. The water is rising fast. It's up to the church steps now. I can see houses floating by like boats, carrying everything people worked their whole lives to build. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store decided to stay in her house, said she'd rather drown in her own kitchen than die as a refugee in some government relocation camp. The announcer's voice was shaking now, whether from cold or fear or both. I want my wife and children to know that I love them. They're safe in Roanoke with my sister. I chose to stay and keep broadcasting until the end because someone needs to witness this. Someone needs to tell the story of what really happened here. Then came the sound I will never forget. Water rushing into the building, equipment shorting out, and a man's voice calling out one final message before the signal went dead. This is WKVL signing off forever. Remember Millerville. Remember us all. The frequency went silent, but only for a moment. Then the cycle began again. This is WKVL, broadcasting from Millerville, Virginia. The time is 11:37 p.m., and here's what's happening in our community tonight. It was the same broadcast from the first night, word for word, as if the radio station was trapped in an endless loop, replaying the final days of a town that no longer existed. Over the following weeks, I documented every broadcast. The pattern never changed. 3 nights of programming covering the final days of Millerville, then silence, then the cycle repeating. I recorded hours of audio, capturing not just the announcer's words, but the ambient sounds that painted a picture of a community facing its end. I heard children playing in the background during the early broadcasts, their laughter growing more subdued each night as the reality of their situation set in. I heard dogs barking, car engines starting as families packed their belongings, church bells ringing for what the broadcast indicated was the final Sunday service. Most disturbing were the voices that occasionally broke into the transmission. Other residents of Millerville calling in to share their fears, their anger, their resignation. An elderly man who had fought in World War II said he had not survived the Pacific Theater just to be driven from his home by his own government. A young mother worried about her children's future in a strange place where no one would remember their family name. And then there were the voices that should not have been there at all. Marcus, we know you're listening. I nearly fell off my chair when I heard my name come through the radio. The regular broadcast had been interrupted by a voice I did not recognize, speaking directly to me. Marcus Hendricks, weather station operator born in Richmond, Virginia, graduated from Virginia Tech with a degree in atmospheric science. We know who you are, Marcus. We've been waiting for someone like you to hear our story." My hands were shaking as I reached for the microphone. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" "We are the voices that were never supposed to be silenced, the families who chose to stay rather than be relocated. We went down with our town, Marcus, but we never really left. We've been broadcasting our story for 50 years, hoping someone would finally hear us." The voice became clearer, more distinct. It sounded like a middle-aged man, but there was something wrong with it, something that suggested it was not entirely human anymore. "The government thinks they can just erase communities, flood our histories, and pretend we never existed. But the dead have long memories, Marcus, and radio waves have a way of traveling through time when they're powered by enough grief and anger." I tried to maintain some semblance of scientific rationality. "This is impossible. You're describing events from 1973. Dead people don't broadcast radio shows." The voice laughed, a sound like static electricity across water. "Dead is a relative term, Marcus. Our bodies drowned, yes, but our voices, our stories, our rage at being forgotten, that energy has to go somewhere. It found a way to keep broadcasting, to keep telling our story to anyone willing to listen." Over the following nights, I learned the truth about what had happened in Millerville. The official records said that all residents had been successfully relocated before the flooding began, but the radio broadcasts told a different story. Dozens of families had refused to leave. Some were elderly residents who preferred to die in their own homes rather than spend their final years in unfamiliar places. Others were simply too stubborn to accept that their government could force them to abandon everything their families had built over generations. When the flooding began ahead of schedule, these holdouts found themselves trapped. Some managed to reach higher ground and survived for days as the water rose around them. Others barricaded themselves in their homes and went down with their possessions. The radio station operator, a man named William Carey, had stayed to document the disaster. He had broadcasted continuously for 72 hours as the water rose, recording the final moments of a community that was being erased from existence. "We made a pact, Marcus," the voice explained during one of our conversations. "All of us who stayed behind. We agreed that if we were going to die for our principles, our deaths would mean something. We would keep telling our story until someone in authority finally listened." "I'm just a weather station operator," I protested. "I don't have any authority to change anything." "But you have something more valuable than authority, Marcus. You have the ability to bear witness, to remember us, to tell others what really happened here." The broadcasts continued, but now they were interactive. I could ask questions, and the voices of long-dead Millerville residents would answer. I learned about their lives, their families, their reasons for choosing death over displacement. Mrs. Henderson, the grocery store owner, had been born in the house her grandfather built in 1887. She had raised 6 children there, buried 2 husbands, and weathered the Great Depression by extending credit to neighbors who could not afford food. When the government offered her relocation compensation, she had torn up the check and mailed the pieces back. "This house has my whole life in its walls," her voice told me through the radio. "Every Christmas morning, every birthday party, every time I rocked a sick child to sleep, this place holds all of it. You cannot relocate memories, Mr. Hendricks. You cannot compensate for the loss of a lifetime." The most haunting voice belonged to a young boy named Timothy, who had been only 8 years old when the flooding began. His parents had sent him to stay with relatives, but he had snuck back to save his dog, a beagle named Rex, who had hidden under the house when the evacuation began. "I wasn't scared of the water," Timothy's voice explained. "I was scared of leaving Rex all alone. Dogs don't understand about dams and progress and the greater good. Rex just knew that his family was leaving, and he didn't know why." Timothy and Rex had both drowned in the rising water, found days later in the upstairs bedroom of his family's house. My parents never forgave themselves, Timothy continued. They moved to California after it happened. Never talked about Millerville again, never even mentioned my name. It was like I had never existed. But I'm still here, Mr. Hendricks. We're all still here, under the water, keeping each other company. As weeks passed, I realized that the broadcasts were not just random transmissions from the past. They were a form of unfinished business, a cosmic recording that would continue until someone in the living world acknowledged what had really happened in Millerville. The voices were getting stronger, more insistent. They began to broadcast during daylight hours, interrupting my work communications. They wanted their story told, their sacrifice remembered, their deaths to have meaning beyond the hydroelectric power and flood control benefits that had been built on their graves. I tried to contact my supervisors to report the anomalous radio activity, but I could not find the words to explain what was happening without sounding insane. How do you file an official report about ghost broadcasts from a town that had been underwater for 50 years? The crisis came on a night in early December. I was monitoring severe weather moving through the region when every frequency on my radio was suddenly overwhelmed by voices. Not just William Carey and the regular Millerville broadcasts, but dozens of voices, all speaking at once, all demanding to be heard. Tell our story, Marcus. Make them remember us. Don't let them forget what they did to us. We won't be quiet anymore. The voices were so loud, they were causing feedback through my equipment. My weather data transmission was being interrupted by the desperate pleas of people who had been dead for half a century. I'll tell your story, I said into the microphone, shouting to be heard over the chorus of voices. I'll make sure people remember Millerville, but you have to let me do my job. People are depending on the weather data I'm collecting. The voices fell silent immediately. Then William Carey's voice came through, calm and clear. Thank you, Marcus. That's all we ever wanted. For someone to remember that we existed, that we mattered, that our choice to stay meant something. We'll give you peace now, but don't forget your promise. I kept that promise. When my rotation at Devil's Backbone Ridge ended, I wrote a detailed report about the historical significance of the area, including the story of Millerville and the families who had died when the valley was flooded. I submitted it to the Virginia Historical Society, to the National Weather Service archives, and to local newspapers. Most dismissed it as an interesting historical footnote. But some people understood the deeper significance. That progress built on forgotten sacrifices carries a moral weight that does not disappear with time. I requested a transfer to a different weather station after that. I could not handle the isolation anymore, could not trust that the voices from the past would remain silent. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone, I still hear faint signals on the emergency frequencies. Other towns, other voices, other communities that were sacrificed for someone else's definition of the greater good. The Appalachian Mountains are full of such stories. Valleys flooded for reservoirs, communities displaced for highways, families scattered for industrial development. And somewhere in the radio spectrum, their voices are still broadcasting, still waiting for someone to listen, to remember, to bear witness to the human cost of progress. The mountains remember everything, even the voices that were supposed to be silenced forever. The radio waves carry more than just information. They carry the stories of people who refused to be forgotten, who found a way to keep speaking even after death, who will continue broadcasting until someone finally hears them and promises to remember their names. I was researching snake-handling churches for my doctoral thesis in religious anthropology. The pastor of a remote congregation in eastern Kentucky invited me to their most sacred ceremony, one they only performed once a year, deep in the mountains, away from prying eyes. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and I had spent 3 years studying extreme religious practices throughout the American South. My focus was on how isolated communities used dangerous rituals to create social cohesion and demonstrate faith. Snake-handling churches were the perfect subject, a practice that had emerged in Appalachia over a century ago, where believers handled venomous serpents as proof of divine protection. Most snake-handling congregations I had studied were relatively tame affairs. Believers would handle rattlesnakes and copperheads during regular Sunday services, usually for brief periods under controlled conditions. Some congregants drank small amounts of poison, typically strychnine, while others spoke in tongues or laid hands on the sick. It was dangerous, certainly, but the risks were manageable for experienced handlers. But Pastor Ezekiel Crowley's church was different. I had heard whispers about the Church of the Sacred Serpent from other researchers. It was located in a hollow so remote that no government agency had ever successfully investigated it. The congregation practiced what they called true signs following, which supposedly went far beyond the typical snake handling found in other Appalachian churches. Pastor Crowley was a third-generation snake handler whose grandfather had learned directly from George Hensley himself, the man who had started the practice in Tennessee in 1909. When I contacted him about observing their services, he initially refused, saying that outsiders brought spiritual contamination to their sacred spaces. But something changed his mind as he called me back a week later with an invitation that sent chills down my spine. "God has spoken to me about you, Doctor Mitchell," he said in a voice that sounded like gravel sliding down a mountainside. "You are meant to witness the true ceremony, the one we perform only once each year, when the veil between our world and the spirit realm grows thin." The true ceremony, he explained, took place on the night of the autumn equinox, in a cave system that his family had been using for religious purposes since the 1920s. It was not just snake handling. It was communion with forces that predated Christianity, beings that his congregation believed were the source of all serpent power. I arrived in Ravens Hollow, Kentucky on September 20th. The town consisted of about 30 families scattered throughout a valley so deep that cell phone signals could not penetrate, and GPS systems showed nothing but blank space. Pastor Crowley met me at the only gas station, a weathered building that looked like it had not been updated since the 1950s. He was not what I had expected. Most snake-handling pastors I had met were charismatic figures, men who commanded attention through force of personality and biblical knowledge. Crowley was different, quiet, almost withdrawn, with pale gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His daughter, Rebecca, a girl of about 16, accompanied him. She had the same unsettling gaze as her father, and when she looked at me, I felt like she was examining my soul for defects. "Are you prepared for what you will see?" Crowley asked as we drove deeper into the hollow on roads that were barely more than deer paths. "The true ceremony is not like the services you have studied. We do not handle snakes to prove our faith. We handle them to feed something much older." I assured him that I was prepared for anything, that my years of research had exposed me to the most extreme religious practices in America. But even as I said it, I felt a growing unease about what I had gotten myself into. The Church of the Sacred Serpent was not a building in any conventional sense. It was a natural cave opening in the side of a limestone cliff, expanded over generations into a complex of interconnected chambers. The main worship space was a circular cavern about 50 feet across, with smooth walls that gleamed wetly in the light of dozens of kerosene lanterns. But it was the snakes that made me question everything I thought I knew about religious serpent handling. There were hundreds of them. Rattlesnakes, copperheads, cottonmouths, and species I did not recognize. Serpents with patterns and colors that seemed to shift in the flickering lamplight. They moved freely throughout the cave, not confined to boxes or containers like in other churches I had visited. Some were massive, easily 12 feet long and thick as a man's thigh. "They live here," Rebecca explained when she saw my amazed expression. "This has been their sanctuary for thousands of years. We are the guests in their domain." The congregation consisted of about 40 people, all from families who had been practicing this form of worship for generations. They spoke in whispers and moved with the careful precision of people who had learned to coexist with deadly predators. Children as young as 10 years old walked casually among serpents that could kill an adult with a single bite. As the ceremony began, I understood why this church had remained hidden from academic study. This was not Christianity as practiced anywhere else in the world. It was something far older, something that had merely adopted Christian terminology to disguise its true nature. Pastor Crowley stood in the center of the cavern, surrounded by a living carpet of snakes that parted before, his feet like water. When he spoke, his voice echoed strangely off the cave walls, creating harmonics that seemed to resonate in frequencies below human hearing. "Tonight we commune with the first serpent," he announced, "the one who brought knowledge to humanity in the garden, the one who showed us that death is not the end, but merely another form of existence." The congregation began to chant in a language I did not recognize. It was not glossolalia, the speaking in tongues common to Pentecostal churches, but something structured and ancient, with rhythms that suggested it had been spoken in these caves for centuries. The snakes responded to the chanting. They began to move in coordinated patterns, forming spirals and geometric shapes on the cave floor. Their movements were too organized to be natural, too purposeful to be random. It was as if they were participating in the ceremony, not merely tolerating human presence. "The serpents are the messengers," Rebecca whispered to me as the ritual continued. "They carry our prayers to the deep places where the old gods still dwell. In return, they bring back gifts, knowledge, power, protection from those who would destroy our way of life." I watched in fascination as congregation members began to interact with the snakes in ways that defied every safety protocol I had ever learned about venomous reptile handling. Children picked up massive rattlesnakes like household pets. Elderly women allowed copperheads to coil around their necks while they sang hymns. Men danced with cottonmouths wrapped around their arms and legs, but no one was bitten. Despite handling the most dangerous serpents in North America with complete disregard for safety, not a single person showed signs of envenomation. "How is this possible?" I asked Rebecca. She smiled, and for a moment I saw something that was definitely not human looking out through her 16-year-old eyes. "We made a covenant long ago," she said. "Our ancestors, when they first found this cave, the serpents agreed to protect us, to grant us immunity to their venom, to share their ancient wisdom. In exchange, we provide them with something they cannot obtain on their own." "What kind of something?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I did not want to know the answer. "Souls," Rebecca replied calmly. "Human souls, freely given. Once each year, during the true ceremony, someone from our congregation offers themselves to the serpents. Not death, transformation. They become part of the collective consciousness that guides and protects our community." I felt my blood turn to ice water. "You're talking about human sacrifice." "We prefer to think of it as transcendence," Pastor Crowley said, appearing beside us with the silent movement of someone who had spent years walking among predators. "The chosen one does not die. They become something greater. They join with the serpent spirits, gaining eternal life and wisdom beyond human understanding." He gestured toward the cave walls, and I noticed for the first time that they were covered with carved names and dates, some going back over a century. Each carving was accompanied by a small niche containing what looked like shed snake skins. "These are our saints," Crowley explained. "Our family members and friends who chose transcendence over ordinary human existence. They are still with us, still guiding us, still protecting our community from the outside world that would destroy our faith." I began to back toward the cave entrance, but found my way blocked by congregation members who had moved to surround me. Their faces were calm, almost serene, but there was something in their eyes that spoke of absolute conviction and complete willingness to do whatever their faith demanded. "You came here seeking knowledge, Doctor," Mitchell, Pastor Crowley continued. "You wanted to understand the deepest mysteries of our faith. We are prepared to share those mysteries with you, to grant you insights that no other researcher has ever obtained." Rebecca stepped closer to me, and I could see that her pupils had become vertical slits, like those of a serpent. "The serpents have chosen you," she said, in a voice that carried harmonics no human throat should have been able to produce. "They have been waiting for someone like you, educated, skeptical, strong enough to survive the transformation process. You would make an excellent addition to our spiritual family." I realized then that I had not been invited to observe the ceremony. I was intended to be the sacrifice. The congregation began to chant again, and the snakes responded by forming a living circle around me. They reared up on their coils, swaying in unison, their eyes reflecting the lamplight like hundreds of tiny mirrors. I could feel something pressing against my mind, a presence vast and alien and completely inhuman. "Do not fight it," Pastor Crowley advised. "The joining process is easier if you accept it willingly. Resistance only causes unnecessary pain during the transformation." I felt my consciousness being probed by something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Images flashed through my mind: the history of the church, the true nature of the covenant, the fate of previous researchers who had stumbled upon their secret. The Church of the Sacred Serpent was not a Christian denomination that practiced snake handling. It was a front for something much older, a cult that worshipped beings that had existed since before humanity evolved, entities that took the form of serpents, but were actually interdimensional parasites that fed on human consciousness. The congregation members were not really human anymore. They were hybrid beings, their minds partially consumed by serpent entities, their bodies slowly transforming to accommodate their new nature. The children born into the church were never fully human to begin with. They were bred to be perfect hosts for the serpent spirits. And now they wanted to add my knowledge, my education, my research abilities to their collective consciousness. I broke free from the mental probe through sheer force of will and desperation. The academic part of my mind was still functioning, still analyzing what I was experiencing in terms of social psychology and religious extremism. That clinical detachment gave me the strength to resist the seductive whispers promising eternal life and infinite wisdom. I grabbed one of the kerosene lanterns and smashed it against the cave floor. The flames spread quickly across the oil, creating a barrier between myself and the congregation. The serpents recoiled from the fire, and for a moment the cave was filled with angry hissing and the sound of hundreds of reptiles fleeing deeper into the cave system. I ran for the entrance, but Pastor Crowley moved to block my path. His transformation was more advanced than the others. His skin had taken on a scaled texture, and when he opened his mouth to speak, I could see fangs where his canines should have been. "You cannot leave, Doctor." "Mitchell," he said, "you have seen too much, learned too much. The serpent spirits will not allow their secrets to be revealed to the outside world." I grabbed another lantern and threw it at him. The glass shattered against his chest, soaking him in burning kerosene. He screamed, not with a human voice, but with the sound a snake makes when it is dying. The scream was picked up and echoed by hundreds of serpents throughout the cave system, creating a cacophony that threatened to drive me insane. I ran through the cave entrance and into the night. Behind me, I could hear the congregation pursuing, but they moved with the careful precision of reptiles, not the desperate speed of humans. I had a head start, and I intended to use every second of it. My rental car was parked at the gas station 2 miles down the mountain. I ran through the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks, guided only by starlight and the memory of the path I had taken into the hollow. Behind me, I could hear voices calling my name, promising forgiveness if I would return, threatening horrible consequences if I revealed their secrets. I reached my car and drove out of Ravens Hollow without stopping. I did not slow down until I was back on the interstate, surrounded by the normal sounds of civilization. Only then did I allow myself to process what had happened. I never published my research on the Church of the Sacred Serpent. How could I? Who would believe a story about snake-worshipping cultists who fed human souls to interdimensional parasites? My academic career was built on credible research, not sensational horror stories that sounded like the plot of a B-grade movie. But I kept the recordings I had made during the ceremony. Audio evidence of the impossible chanting, the coordinated movement of hundreds of venomous snakes, the inhuman sounds that came from the throats of people who were no longer entirely human. Last month, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Rebecca Crowley, standing in front of a university building I recognized as the campus where I now teach. She looked exactly the same as she had 5 years ago, not a day older, but her transformation was more advanced. Her skin had a distinctly reptilian texture, and her eyes were completely serpentine. On the back of the photograph was a message written in her careful handwriting. "The serpents are patient, Dr. Mitchell. They do not forget those who have been chosen. We will see you again when the veil grows thin. I have requested a transfer to a university on the West Coast. I have changed my name and destroyed all records of my research into Appalachian religious practices. But I know it will not matter. The Church of the Sacred Serpent has resources beyond human understanding, and they have marked me for eventual collection. Sometimes late at night, I hear serpents moving through the walls of my apartment. I know they are not really there. No snakes could survive in an urban environment hundreds of miles from their natural habitat. But I also know that distance and time mean different things to beings that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The mountains of eastern Kentucky hold secrets that predate human civilization. Some religious practices are not about faith or salvation. They are about feeding things that should never have been awakened. And some churches are not sanctuaries for human souls, but processing centers for an alien intelligence that views humanity as nothing more than a convenient food source. The serpent in the Garden of Eden offered knowledge to humanity, but the story never mentioned the price of that knowledge, or what the serpent intended to do with the souls it collected in exchange for wisdom. The Church of the Sacred Serpent knows the rest of that story, and they have been paying the price for centuries, one soul at a time. I just pray that when they finally come for me, the transformation process will be as painless as Pastor Crowley promised, because I know now that there is no escape from the covenant his ancestors made in those deep caves. Some debts can only be paid with the currency of human consciousness, and some religious practices are designed to harvest souls for beings that exist beyond the boundaries of our reality. The serpents remember everyone who has been chosen, and they are very, very patient. 3 children went missing during a school camping trip in the remote mountains of West Virginia. I was part of the search team. We found them after 5 days, but they were not the same children who went missing. My name is Detective Sarah Walsh, and I had been working missing persons cases for the state police for 8 years. I specialized in wilderness searches, coordinating between local law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and volunteer groups when children disappeared in the vast Appalachian wilderness. Most cases ended well, lost hikers found within hours, children who had wandered too far from camp reunited with frantic parents. But the case of the Millfield Elementary camping trip would haunt me for the rest of my career. The incident began on October 12th, when Millfield Elementary School organized their annual 5th grade camping trip to Bear Creek Hollow, a remote area in the Monongahela National Forest. 28 students, 4 teachers, and 6 parent volunteers made the journey to what was supposed to be a safe, educational outdoor experience. The campsite was in a valley surrounded by steep ridges, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through miles of dense forest. Everything went normally for the first 2 days. Students participated in nature walks, learned about local wildlife, and enjoyed the typical camping activities that had made this trip a school tradition for over 20 years. But on the morning of October 14th, 3 children failed to appear for breakfast. Emma Rodriguez, age 11, had been the responsible leader of her cabin group. Her teacher described her as mature beyond her years, someone who always followed rules and looked out for younger students. Michael Chen, also 11, was quiet and studious, more interested in collecting interesting rocks than participating in group activities. The third missing child, Lucy Brennan, age 10, was known for her imagination and her tendency to wander off when something caught her attention. The initial search was methodical and thorough. Teachers and parent volunteers spread out in organized search patterns, calling the children's names and checking every obvious hiding place within a half-mile radius of the camp. When that yielded no results, the school contacted local authorities. I arrived at Bear Creek Hollow 6 hours after the children were reported missing. By then, the temperature was dropping as evening approached, and everyone understood that 3 unprepared children would not survive a night in the mountains without shelter. We expanded the search immediately. State police, county sheriff deputies, volunteer fire departments, and experienced wilderness search teams converged on the area. We brought in tracking dogs, thermal imaging equipment, and a helicopter when weather permitted. The search grid covered 12 square miles of some of the most rugged terrain in West Virginia. But something was wrong from the beginning. The tracking dogs could not pick up any scent trails leading away from the campsite. It was as if the 3 children had simply vanished without leaving any trace of their passage through the forest. Experienced trackers found no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no pieces of clothing caught on branches. For children who had supposedly wandered into dense woods, they had left remarkably little evidence of their movement. Local residents we interviewed had their own theories about what might have happened. Bear Creek Hollow had a reputation among mountain people as a place where strange things occurred. Children had gone missing there before, they said, though never during organized camping trips with adult supervision. That hollow has always been different, explained Martha Stevenson, an elderly woman who had lived in the area her entire life. My grandmother used to warn us about the hollow children, things that looked like regular kids but were not really children at all. Said they would try to lure real children away to whatever place they came from. 1-2. The search continued for 5 days. We had nearly 400 volunteers combing every ravine, checking every cave, following every deer trail. The media attention was intense, with news crews broadcasting updates around the clock. The families of the missing children maintained a vigil at the command post, refusing to give up hope even as the statistical probability of finding the children alive decreased with each passing hour. On the afternoon of October 19th, everything changed. A volunteer searcher found the 3 children sitting calmly beside Bear Creek, about 3 miles downstream from the campsite. They were clean, well-fed, and showed no signs of exposure or distress. When the searcher called out to them, they looked up with mild curiosity, as if they had been expecting to be found. The reunion should have been a moment of pure joy and relief. But from the moment I saw those children, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. They looked exactly like Emma, Michael, and Lucy. Same faces, same hair, same physical characteristics down to a small scar on Emma's left hand from a bicycle accident the previous summer. But their mannerisms were different. Their speech patterns had changed. Most unsettling of all, they seemed to have no memory of being lost or of the 5 days that had passed since their disappearance. "We were just playing by the creek," Emma explained when I interviewed her. "We did not realize anyone was looking for us." But Emma had never spoken with such formal, precise diction before. Her teacher noted that her vocabulary seemed more advanced, her sentence structure more complex. It was as if someone had taught her to speak more carefully, more deliberately. Michael, who had been shy and withdrawn before the camping trip, now made direct eye contact and answered questions with confidence that seemed unnatural for his personality. He described finding interesting rocks during their time away, but when asked to show these rocks, he could not produce any. Lucy's changes were the most dramatic. The imaginative, energetic child, who had been known for her elaborate stories about fairies and magical creatures, now spoke in simple, factual sentences. When asked about where they had been for 5 days, she replied, "We were learning about the forest. The teachers were very patient with us." "What teachers?" I asked. Lucy looked confused for a moment, as if she had misspoken. "I mean, we were teaching ourselves about nature." The medical examinations were thorough but revealed nothing conclusive. The children appeared healthy, well-nourished, and free from injury. Their vital signs were normal. Blood work showed no signs of drugs or toxins, but there were subtle physical differences that the medical team could not explain. Emma's fingerprints matched her school records perfectly, but her dental records showed minor discrepancies. Teeth that appeared to have developed slightly differently than previous x-rays indicated. Michael's height and weight were within normal ranges, but he seemed to have grown nearly an inch during the 5 days he was missing. Lucy's eye color appeared subtly different in certain lighting conditions, though photographs were inconclusive. The families were so relieved to have their children back that they initially dismissed concerns about behavioral changes. Children could be traumatized by getting lost, they reasoned. Maybe the experience had made them more mature, more cautious, more withdrawn. These changes would fade with time and counseling. But the changes did not fade. They became more pronounced. Within weeks of returning home, all 3 children began displaying knowledge and abilities they had never possessed before. Emma started speaking conversational Spanish, despite never having studied the language. Michael could identify geological formations and mineral compositions with expertise that impressed his science teacher. Lucy began drawing detailed maps of the local forest system, marking trails and landmarks that she should never have seen. More disturbing were the physical changes that continued after their return. All 3 children seemed to require less sleep than before, often staying awake until well past midnight without showing signs of fatigue. Their appetites changed dramatically. They consumed enormous quantities of fresh fruits and vegetables while showing distaste for processed foods they had previously enjoyed. Their social relationships deteriorated as well. Former friends found them strange and distant. The children seemed to have lost interest in typical childhood activities, preferring to spend time outdoors, often staring at the forest with expressions of longing that worried their parents. I continued investigating the case long after it was officially closed. The discovery of the children alive and unharmed was considered a successful resolution, but I could not shake the feeling that we had failed to uncover the real truth about what happened in Bear Creek Hollow. My research led me to historical records dating back over a century. Bear Creek Hollow had indeed been the site of numerous unexplained disappearances. Children, and occasionally adults, would vanish without a trace, only to reappear days or weeks later, with no memory of where they had been. In many cases, family members reported that the returned individuals seemed different in subtle but persistent ways. The pattern was remarkably consistent across decades. The missing would be found in good health beside Bear Creek, always in the same general location. They would claim to have no memory of being lost, often insisting they had only been gone for hours rather than days, and in every case, those who returned displayed new knowledge, altered personalities, or physical changes that their families could not explain. Local folklore provided its own explanation for these incidents. According to Cherokee traditions that predated European settlement, Bear Creek Hollow was a place where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. The Hollow children were beings from another realm who occasionally crossed into our world, sometimes taking humans back with them for purposes unknown. 3-1. They look just like regular children, Martha Stevenson had explained during my initial interview, but they are not born the way human children are born. They are made to serve some purpose we do not understand. Sometimes they come back alone. Sometimes they bring our children with them. Sometimes they trade places entirely. 6 months after the camping trip incident, I made a decision that effectively ended my law enforcement career. I returned to Bear Creek Hollow alone, without official authorization, determined to learn the truth about what lived in those woods. I hiked to the exact location where the 3 children had been found. The area appeared normal during daylight hours, just another stretch of mountain creek, with nothing to distinguish it from hundreds of similar locations throughout Appalachia. But as evening approached, I began to notice subtle changes in the environment. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. Birds stopped singing, insects ceased their buzzing, even the sound of wind through the trees seemed muted. The air itself felt different, thicker, more humid, charged with a kind of energy that made my skin prickle. Then I saw them. Children emerged from the forest in small groups, walking silently toward the creek. They moved with purposeful coordination like students arriving for a scheduled lesson. There were dozens of them, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 16, all dressed in clean, simple clothing that looked handmade but well-crafted. What struck me immediately was how similar they looked to the missing children from the camping trip. Not identical, but sharing certain features. The same careful way of moving, the same direct gaze, the same slightly formal manner of interaction. These were the Hollow children, the beings that local folklore warned about. I watched from concealment as they gathered beside the creek. They spoke to each other in low voices, but their conversation had an artificial quality, as if they were reciting memorized dialogue rather than engaging in natural communication. Some of them carried objects I could not identify, tools or instruments that seemed too sophisticated for children to have crafted. One of the older children noticed my presence despite my attempts at concealment. She approached my hiding place with no sign of fear or caution, stopping just close enough for conversation. "You are the one who has been asking questions," she said, in a voice that sounded like Emma Rodriguez, but somehow was not quite right. "The one who wants to understand what happened to the children from the camping trip." I stepped out from behind the tree where I had been watching. "What are you? Where do you come from?" She smiled with an expression that was both childlike and ancient. "We come from the deep places, the spaces between what you call reality. We have always been here, learning from your kind, trying to understand what it means to be truly human." "What did you do with Emma, Michael, and Lucy?" "We traded places with them," she replied matter-of-factly. "They wanted to see our world, and we needed to experience yours. It is a fair exchange, though perhaps not one their families would have chosen if they had understood the terms." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "You mean the children who came back?" "Are us, yes. We have taken their forms, learned their mannerisms, absorbed their memories. But we are not them, and they are not us. They are safe in our realm, learning our ways as we learn theirs. Whether they will ever choose to return, that remains to be seen." She gestured toward the other Hollow children, who had continued their mysterious activities beside the creek. "We have been making these exchanges for generations. Sometimes your people come willingly, attracted by the promise of knowledge beyond human understanding. Sometimes we must be more creative in arranging the meetings. The camping trip was planned, I asked. Encouraged, she corrected. We influenced the school's decision to use this location, ensured that the right children would be present at the right time. Emma, Michael, and Lucy were chosen because they possessed qualities we wished to study: leadership, curiosity, imagination. In exchange, we gave your world 3 of our kind who could observe human society from within. I realized then that this was not a recent phenomenon. How many children in the surrounding communities were actually these hollow children, living among humans while gathering information for purposes I could not fathom? How many families were unknowingly raising beings that only resembled their actual offspring? "What do you want from us?" I asked. The hollow child's smile became more genuine, more recognizably human. "To understand what makes you truly alive. We can mimic your forms, replicate your behaviors, even access your memories. But there is something essential about humanity that we have never been able to reproduce. We keep trying, keep learning, hoping that someday we might discover the secret of what you call the soul." She turned to rejoin the other hollow children, then paused to look back at me. "Your investigation ends here, Detective Walsh. You have learned what you came to learn. Share this knowledge with others if you choose, but know that no one will believe you, and know that we will be watching to see what you do with the truth." I left Bear Creek Hollow that night and never returned. I submitted my resignation from the state police the following week, citing personal reasons. I moved to California and took a job in private security, as far from the Appalachian Mountains as I could manage. But the knowledge I gained in that hollow haunts me every day. How many of the children I see in my new neighborhood are actually human? How many are hollow children, continuing their patient study of humanity, while their human counterparts live as prisoners in a realm beyond our understanding? Emma Rodriguez, Michael Chen, and Lucy Brennan were never truly found. The beings that returned in their place continue to live with their families, growing up as perfect imitations of the children they replaced. Their parents notice the changes but attribute them to normal development, trauma recovery, or adolescent growth. Meanwhile, somewhere in the spaces between realities, 3 real children are learning what it means to be something other than human. Whether they will ever have the chance to return home depends on knowledge and decisions that exist far beyond the boundaries of our world. The hollow children are patient. They have been conducting their exchanges for generations, slowly building their understanding of humanity one stolen child at a time. And in the deep woods of Appalachia, they continue their work, always watching for the next opportunity to trade places with the children of unsuspecting families who venture too far into places where ancient boundaries have grown thin. The mountains remember every exchange that has ever been made, and some trades, once completed, can never be undone. The underground coal fire had been burning for decades beneath the mountains of southwestern Pennsylvania. My job was to assess if it could be contained. What I found was not just fire, that there were things living in those burning tunnels that should never have existed. My name is Dr. James Morrison, and I had been working as a geological consultant for the Environmental Protection Agency for 12 years. I specialized in subsurface fires, particularly the coal seam fires that plagued mining regions throughout Appalachia. These underground blazes could burn for decades or even centuries, consuming vast networks of coal deposits while slowly poisoning the surface environment with toxic gases and unstable ground conditions. The Centralia incident in Pennsylvania was the most famous example, an underground fire that had been burning since 1962, eventually forcing the abandonment of an entire town. But the fire beneath Mount Carmel was different. It had started in 1958, when a lightning strike ignited an exposed coal seam, and despite numerous attempts at containment, It continued to spread through the mountain's extensive underground mining networks. What made Mount Carmel unique was its geological structure. The mountain contained not just coal deposits, but a complex system of natural caves and abandoned mine shafts that created perfect conditions for the fire to spread in unpredictable directions. Local residents reported ground temperatures that exceeded 200 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas, along with toxic gas emissions that made entire neighborhoods uninhabitable. My assignment was straightforward: determine if the Mount Carmel fire could be extinguished using current technology, or if the area should be declared permanently uninhabitable like Centralia. The EPA needed definitive answers before committing millions of dollars to containment efforts that might prove futile. I arrived in the town of Mount Carmel on a gray November morning. The community had been slowly dying for decades as the underground fire made life increasingly difficult. Property values had collapsed, businesses had closed, and most residents had relocated with government assistance. Only about 300 people remained, mostly elderly residents who refused to abandon homes their families had owned for generations. The signs of the underground fire were everywhere. Steam rose from cracks in sidewalks where heated groundwater reached the surface. Dead zones marked areas where toxic gases had killed all vegetation. Some streets had partially collapsed as the fire weakened underground support structures. The air smelled of sulfur and burning coal, an acrid odor that invaded every building and clung to clothing and hair. Mayor Patricia Kowalski met me at the municipal building, one of the few government offices still operating in the town. She was a woman in her 60s who had lived in Mount Carmel her entire life, watching the community slowly succumb to the fire that burned beneath their feet. "Dr. Morrison, I appreciate you coming here," she said, as we reviewed maps of the fire's known extent. "But I have to be honest. We've had dozens of experts over the years, and none of them have been able to do anything except document how much worse the situation gets each year." The fire had consumed an estimated 12 square miles of underground coal deposits, creating a network of burning tunnels that extended far beyond the original ignition site. Ground-penetrating radar showed void spaces that suggested the fire had broken through into natural cave systems, potentially spreading into areas that had never been mapped. "What we need to understand," I explained to the mayor, "is whether the fire has reached a sustainable equilibrium or if it's still actively expanding. If we can identify the leading edges of the burn zone, we might be able to create containment barriers." My initial surveys confirmed what I had expected. The fire was still spreading, though more slowly than in previous decades. Temperature readings showed hotspots extending well beyond the mapped burn zone, indicating that the fire had found new fuel sources in previously unknown coal deposits. But it was the gas emissions that first suggested something unusual was happening beneath Mount Carmel. Standard coal seam fires produce predictable byproducts: carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and various hydrocarbon compounds. The gases I detected coming from fissures around the fire zone included these expected compounds, but also organic molecules that should not have been present in a purely geological fire. I found traces of complex proteins, amino acid chains, and even what appeared to be genetic material, DNA and RNA fragments that suggested biological processes were occurring in the extreme heat of the underground fire. This was impossible according to conventional understanding of thermodynamics and biochemistry. No known life forms could survive in environments where temperatures exceeded 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet the chemical evidence suggested that not only were organisms living in the fire zone, they were thriving and reproducing in conditions that should have been instantly lethal to any form of life. I needed to get closer to the source of these anomalous readings. Using historical mining records, I identified several abandoned shaft openings that provided access to the underground tunnel network. Most had been sealed decades ago, But I located one shaft on the outskirts of town that was still partially accessible. The Kowalski family mine had been abandoned in 1952, 6 years before the fire started. The shaft descended nearly 400 feet before connecting to a network of horizontal tunnels that followed the coal seams through the mountain. According to my calculations, these tunnels passed within 100 yards of the current fire zone, close enough to take direct samples of the gases and possibly observe the fire's behavior firsthand. I equipped myself with specialized heat-resistant gear, gas monitoring equipment, and emergency oxygen supplies. The descent into the Kowalski shaft was like entering a prehistoric cave system, with walls that showed the pick marks of miners who had worked there 70 years earlier. The temperature increased dramatically as I moved deeper into the mountain. By the time I reached the main tunnel level, my instruments showed ambient air temperatures of over 150 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with moisture and chemical vapors that made breathing difficult despite my filtration equipment. I followed the main tunnel toward the fire zone, guided by temperature readings that climbed steadily as I approached the burning areas. The tunnel walls began to show signs of heat stress, cracked concrete, twisted steel support beams, and sections where the ceiling had partially collapsed from thermal expansion. Then I began to see the first signs of impossible life. Growing from the tunnel walls were structures that looked like coral formations, but coral that had adapted to extreme heat instead of ocean environments. These formations were orange and red, glowing with their own internal light, and they pulsed rhythmically as if breathing. When I took samples, my instruments detected complex organic chemistry, proteins and lipids that remained stable at temperatures that should have destroyed any biological molecules instantly. The formations were not just surviving in the extreme heat. They were using the thermal energy as a power source, converting heat into chemical energy through metabolic processes that violated everything I understood about biochemistry. As I moved closer to the fire zone, the heat-adapted organisms became more diverse and more complex. I found what appeared to be fungal networks that had spread throughout the tunnel system, creating interconnected webs of heat-resistant organic material. Some sections of tunnel were completely overgrown with these thermal organisms, creating biological barriers that channeled airflow and actually seemed to be directing the fire's spread in specific directions. The organisms were not just adapting to the fire, they were controlling it. I reached the edge of the active fire zone just as my temperature readings crossed into lethal ranges for human survival. Through the shimmering heat distortion, I could see the burning coal seams that had been consuming the mountain for decades. But what I observed defied geological explanation. The fire was not spreading randomly through available fuel sources. It was following planned patterns, creating organized networks of burning tunnels that formed geometric designs when viewed from above. The fire was being cultivated, managed, directed by the heat-adapted organisms that had colonized the underground environment. And at the center of the fire zone, I saw something that challenged my understanding of what life could become under extreme conditions. There were structures that looked like buildings, but buildings grown rather than constructed. Organic architecture that rose from the burning coal seams themselves, shaped by organisms that had learned to use the intense heat as both energy source and construction material. These structures glowed with internal fire, their walls pulsing with the rhythm of some vast circulatory system. Moving through these impossible structures were beings that had once been human. I recognized them from missing person reports that dated back decades. Hikers, spelunkers, geologists, and mine workers who had disappeared in the Mount Carmel area over the years. But they had been transformed by exposure to the extreme heat and the organisms that thrived in it. Their skin had taken on the orange-red coloration of the heat-adapted organisms. Their bodies had been restructured to survive in temperatures that would instantly kill normal humans. They moved with purposeful coordination, tending to the fire as if it were a garden, cultivating the burning coal seams and guiding their expansion through the mountain. One of them noticed my presence and approached the edge of the fire zone where I crouched behind heat-resistant equipment. When he spoke, his voice carried the crackling sound of flames, and his words emerged as superheated vapor that shimmered in the air. "Dr. Morrison," he said, somehow knowing my name. "We have been expecting you. The fire told us you were coming." I recognized his face despite the thermal adaptations. Dr. Michael Chen, a geologist who had disappeared while studying the Mount Carmel fire in 1987. He had been missing for nearly 40 years, presumed dead, but here he stood, transformed into something that could survive in conditions that would kill any normal human instantly. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice distorted by the heat-resistant breathing apparatus. "Evolution," he replied. "Accelerated adaptation to an environment that demands new forms of life. The fire is not destroying the mountain, Dr. Morrison. It is remaking it, creating conditions for organisms that could never exist in your cold, lifeless surface world." He gestured toward the organic structures that rose from the burning coal seams. "This is what life becomes when it is freed from the limitations of moderate temperatures. When thermal energy becomes abundant rather than scarce. We are not dying down here. We are becoming something greater." Other transformed humans emerged from the fire-grown structures, all of them people who had been reported missing over the decades. Some were recent disappearances, others dated back to the early days of the fire. All had undergone the same thermal adaptation process, their bodies restructured to thrive in the extreme heat environment. "The fire called to us," Dr. Chen explained. "Those of us with the right genetic markers, the right psychological makeup. It offered transformation instead of death, evolution instead of extinction. We chose to embrace the change rather than flee from it. I realized then that the Mount Carmel fire was not a natural disaster to be contained. It was a form of directed evolution, a process by which life was adapting to conditions that would become more common as the planet's climate changed. These thermal organisms and their human symbionts were developing survival strategies for a much hotter world." "What do you want from the surface?" I asked. "Nothing," Dr. Chen replied. "We have everything we need here, but the surface world will need us eventually, when the old forms of life can no longer survive the increasing heat. We are the future, Dr. Morrison, the next step in human evolution." He pointed toward tunnels that led deeper into the mountain, where the glow of the fire was even more intense. "The fire has spread much farther than your surface instruments can detect. It has reached the deep coal seams, the deposits that have been burning underground for millions of years. We are connected now to thermal networks that span continents, part of a global system that is preparing for the world that is coming." The implications were staggering. If thermal-adapted organisms were spreading through underground coal deposits worldwide, they could be creating a parallel biosphere adapted to extreme heat conditions. As climate change made surface environments less habitable, these underground communities might represent humanity's only chance for long-term survival. But the transformation process was irreversible. Those who joined the thermal communities could never return to surface life. They became something new, something adapted to conditions that would kill unmodified humans instantly. "Your report will recommend abandoning Mount Carmel," Dr. Chen said. "That is what we want. The fewer surface dwellers who come near the fire, the better for everyone. We need time to complete our work, to develop the adaptations that will be necessary for the next phase of human existence." I left the underground fire zone that day with data that I could never include in my official report. How could I explain that the Mount Carmel fire was not a geological disaster but a evolutionary laboratory, that the missing persons cases spanning decades were actually successful recruitments for a post-human society adapted to extreme heat conditions. My EPA report recommended permanent evacuation of the Mount Carmel area and classification of the fire zone as a long-term environmental hazard. The remaining residents were relocated with federal assistance, and the area was declared uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. But I know the real reason the government wanted the area cleared. My superiors understood the implications of my classified findings. The thermal organisms and their human symbionts represented a form of directed evolution that could spread to other underground fire zones worldwide. The Mount Carmel fire continues to burn, no longer monitored by surface authorities. According to my contacts in the environmental monitoring community, similar thermal adaptations have been detected at underground fire sites in China, Australia, and India. The global network of heat-adapted life forms is expanding, preparing for a world where extreme temperatures become the norm rather than the exception. I still monitor seismic and thermal data from the Mount Carmel area through unofficial channels. The fire has spread far beyond its original boundaries, creating vast underground communities that exist in parallel to surface civilization. Ground temperatures in some areas now exceed 800 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions that would be instantly lethal to unmodified humans, but apparently ideal for the thermal-adapted beings that live there. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I receive radio transmissions on frequencies that should not carry signals from underground sources. Messages from the fire communities, reports on their expansion and development, discussions of when they might be ready to make contact with surface governments. They are preparing for a time when the surface world becomes too hot for normal human habitation, when the thermal adaptations they have developed become necessary for survival. Climate change is accelerating, and the extreme heat conditions that exist in places like Mount Carmel may eventually spread to surface environments worldwide. The coal seam fire was never really about geology. It was about evolution, about life finding ways to survive in conditions that seem impossible. And in the burning depths beneath the Appalachian Mountains, humanity's thermal-adapted descendants are waiting patiently for the rest of us to realize that the old forms of life cannot survive in the world we are creating. The fire remembers everyone who has ever descended into its depths. And some transformations, once begun, continue burning long after the original source of ignition has been forgotten. The Mount Carmel fire will burn for centuries more, not as a disaster to be contained, but as an evolutionary crucible preparing life forms for a much hotter future. In the deep places where coal has burned for millions of years, new forms of consciousness are emerging from the flames. And they are very patient because they know that eventually the surface world will need what they have learned about surviving in the heat of a changing planet.